Welcome to another episode of Deepen with Christina. I'm your host, Christina Weber, founder of We Deepen, wedeepen.com. If you haven't today, go to the website, go to wedeepen.com, check out all of the transformational and growth-oriented experiences that are helping to catalyze people into more deeper, loving relationships through experience. Because when you experience love, when you feel it in your heart, when surrounded by it, it's so much more easier to bring it home to your family as well as at the grocery store, of saying hi, smiling, connecting with human beings. Today, I have Ariel Saint White here. When I say here, her and I are, I think, Ariel, are you in Montana or Los Angeles?
I'm actually in Topanga Canyon right by the Malibu Mountains.
Ooh, in Topanga. Well, it's so good to have you here. You are somebody that I always admire from afar. And I say from afar because you and I have been in community together and we've collaborated once before. And every time that you write something on social media or out in the world or whatever you're up to, it's always a fascination to me. I'm like, where is Ariel and what is she up to? Thank you for the work that you're doing in the world, because as we starting this podcast, you know, I have this beautiful bio from you that I do want to share because I want people to know who they're hearing from today. But I also could wrap this up as, yes, you're an artist and yes, you're an entrepreneur, but deep down underneath of it, what I see is that you're a relationship activist. You are inspiring deep human connection and love, which is so needed right now. It's always so needed, but so much more deeply needed that we can pierce the world with your energy, and that would feel really good to me.
Well, thank you so much for having me on today, Christina. I love you and I love the work that you stand for in the world. Thank you.
Okay, so as you know, I generally don't read you guys' bios, and I'm not going to necessarily fully read this, but I want to point this out because Ariel is, again, such a fascinating human being, has so many deep layers of creativity and that is injected into her work as an entrepreneur and as an artist. She is the founder of My Little Yoni, which is a sexual wellness company. It's also the world's first vulva superhero. And I think initially, was it first the vagina superhero and now it's the vulva superhero?
Well, we say both. If people care about anatomy, which that's part of our mission, is to help especially kids learn proper anatomy from, young ages onward. Technically, Yoni as a character is a vulva superhero, but in the mainstream, a lot of people just default and say vagina superhero. So we're kind of okay with either. I think in terms of casting the wider net, saying vagina superhero, but as soon as people are inside the world of My Little Yoni, we quickly point out that, hey, technically, this is a vulva, and that the vagina is the muscular canal connecting the uterus to the outside world. But we're already getting into an anatomy lesson at that point.
You're teaching me anatomy still at this point, because I'm a woman and I've studied women's health, and there's still something that I can learn every single day. And My Little Yoni it's teaching children sex ed, correct?
Yeah,
and
that's right.
You've brought in top OBGYNs to consult you and to work with you and to help get this message out to children and parents so that we can make these conversations happen more. Because for me as a child, sex ed happened in maybe when I was 14, and it was a couple weeks, and I am recently 40. We Deepen has a team of interns, and around when My Little Yoni was doing your Kickstarter campaign, it brought up the topic of sex education in our team meetings, and I had heard that, they who have just graduated high school, or 2021, only receiving a month of sex ed. They're like, no, they don't really teach us anything. And it's sort of disappointing of being 2 decades later that children in schools aren't receiving sex education, and parents, because they've never received sex education, aren't necessarily giving it to their children. So what I got when I was 15, I had sex for the first time at 15, and it was with my boyfriend. It was probably 6 months, 7 months into us dating. And my mother asked me one day if my boyfriend and I had sex, and we had just had sex. Of course, moms always know. And I lied to her. I said no. And then I sat with the guilt and sat with the guilt and sat with the guilt. And I said, okay, fine. Yes, we did. But don't tell Dad. She promised she wouldn't tell my dad. Days later, my dad says to me every time I see him, we need to talk. Yes, that face. So I just kept avoiding him like the plague, like not being around my dad. And then one day he called me and he's like, sit down at the table. I sat down at the table and he said, you're too young to be having sex. Stop. And he then said, promise me that you're not going to have sex. And I said, okay, I promise. And I left feeling so much shame, so much guilt, went to my boyfriend's house, told him we're not having sex anymore. That lasted for 4 days. And then we started having sex again. But it was that was the extent of the sex ed in my household. Is now to get into this work, and we're going to go into, I know you have My Little Yoni, which is a big focus for you. And then you also creatively work with couples to inspire them to have healthy relationships or give them experience. So we're going to go into some of that work too. But to start with My Little Yoni, what is it? What happened to you or not happened to you that you have become so inspired by, and you're even a Tantra teacher in the early part of your career. So where did this come from? What experience did you have?
Yeah, that's a great question. And just backing up a moment, thank you for sharing about your experience. And I wish your experience were uncommon, but it's not. It's just very few people, even in 2021, are receiving adequate sex education, which is a huge part of why with My Little Yoni we wrote our 10-book series earlier this year, and that we're on a mission to educate parents really first and foremost, because I think most parents, that it's easy to ignore this conversation and just expect school to handle it. And unless you know the state of how broken sex ed is in our school system, then it's easy to kind of ignore that as a parent. And so we really believe that parents want their kids to have a better time of it than they had, but they can't really provide their kids with those tools or be motivated to provide their kids with those tools if they don't know that there's a problem. So our first step is educating parents. Hey guys, there's a problem. Or hey people, hey parents, there's a problem. And then from there, here's a solution. We've written this incredible, accurate, doctor-approved, sex educator approved book series that is appropriate for kids. Some of our titles are good for kids starting ages 3+, so that's very early. And then all the way to some of our titles are more in the ranges of 7 to 10. And so it's how do we start this conversation earlier? And how do we start these conversations directly inside the home so that any education that does happen inside schools, that's kind of the bonus that may or may not happen, but it's not the thing we're relying on. Because like you're saying, you had 2 weeks of it when you were 14. And we know now that a lot of kids are exposed to porn starting at age 10. Which means we really want to be having these conversations much, much, much earlier. So I'll come back to that in a moment. But to answer your question of how did I come to this or why is it important to me, I would say the earliest influence for me was growing up with a mom who was the survivor of sexual assault and a survivor of sexual abuse. Mm-hmm. And while she didn't remember everything that happened to her, I think part of her wanting to prepare and empower me was with knowledge. So she actually shared a lot of things that were frankly inappropriate for a child to know about. You know, probably at age 7, I knew that there was something called rape that existed. And she wasn't trying to be inappropriate by sharing some of this information and stories with me. I think she was really trying to protect me and just, you know, wanting me to be armed with knowledge. And so certainly it did that, but it also made me really aware of some of the dark sides of how sexuality has been warped in our culture, and you know, some of the predatory behaviors that exist out there. So yeah, from a young age, I was aware of the dark side as it relates to sexual energy and sexuality. And so from a young age, I wanted to protect myself, and I also wanted to change some of this. And so, I was contemplating things that, frankly, children shouldn't have to contemplate. Little bookmark, there are ways of teaching consent and preparing our kids that don't overwhelm them and freak them out. You know, there's developmentally different things that are age appropriate as kids grow up. But yeah, I would say that was the earliest start of paying attention to this stuff. And perhaps as a result of all of that, I guess the positive of knowing about all of that was I was very aware of owning my sexuality for myself. So you shared a little bit about your first time having sex. My first time having sex, I think I was the same age. I was 15 or 16. And it was actually with a friend of mine. He very deliberately was not my boyfriend. So I kind of had the emotional part separate from the physical part. And I was just like, hey, I'm curious. This is an experience I want to have for myself. So I did it in a safe way for myself. And I had that experience and I felt really good about it. And then it was very interesting, the shame I received from my friends. Like so many of my friends shamed me for like, how could you do that with someone who's not your boyfriend? And it was a very strange thing because I'm like, but I don't actually want a boyfriend. I want to have the experience of what sex is because I'm curious about that. It actually felt like an initiation I gave myself in a way. But I'm really focused on school. I was working a job. I was in a touring theater company. I was not interested in what came with a relationship. But that was an interesting lesson early on to see like, oh, wow, when a woman or even a girl becoming a woman owns her sexual experience for herself outside of the paradigm of, you know, you only do this from an emotional place or you only do this from a relationship place, and the shaming that can come with that. And I'd like to think I didn't take it on too much, but that was kind of my first experience of like, oh, wow, when you own your sexual experience as a woman, that's swimming upstream or somehow going against the grain.
Well, it's so interesting because you, in both of your scenarios, it's like you are learning information before your time, before other children of your age knew. You were learning it. So there's a little bit of a disconnect or dissonance that I imagine that you're having with some of these experiences as well.
Yeah, there was. And I think it taught me to, I mean, of course it hurt, and I dealt with that hurt later on, but I think it also really taught me to do my own thing. So I think those kind of reactions for a lot of people would just teach conforming. For me, it had kind of the opposite experience. I guess I became a little bit of a rebel. But what was also interesting, if we're getting personal, which I know is a lot about what Deepen is interested in, you know, I had that first experience of having sex or whatever, and then I didn't actually have sex again for at least a year, not for any other reason other than it was almost like the curiosity like it was like, okay, I like closed a loop on some of that curiosity. And then I was just really focused on my academic work and my work and my theater, my path in the theater arts. And then when I came back to it, it was because I wanted to, but it wasn't really overthought more than that. It was like, if I want to, I will. And if I don't want to, I won't. I think if I were to take a step back, part of what also helped me feel really matter of fact in terms of whether I was engaging with another person or not, was that I actually did have a masturbation practice or self-pleasure practice. So now, of course, I shouldn't say of course, but unsurprisingly, there was still secrecy and some shame around it. It's not like I was openly talking with friends about it. That's
about your meditation, about your masturbation.
No, I was not.
I don't remember any. I still don't really talk to my girlfriends about masturbation.
Which is that's not surprising. It's kind of interesting. It's like, female masturbation and self-pleasure is surprisingly still pretty taboo. There's been a lot of progress in the last few years, but it's still pretty taboo. But even still, being a young person who knew how to give myself orgasms, I think that's a big reason why I wasn't that compelled to seek emotional or physical comfort in the arms of others, or in the arms of boys. I was kind of like, no, I know how to make myself feel good. And yeah, that's a big piece, because this isn't just what I think. There's also a lot of data to suggest this. And a book I highly recommend is called Girls and Sex by Peggy Ornstein. But there's a lot to suggest that when girls grow up disconnected from their own vulva, and when girls grow up not exploring their own bodies at all, they actually are more likely to have early sexual experiences that they may or may not actually want, if that makes sense. And I'm not getting into the territory of assault. That's a whole other territory, but it's more of the idea of, let's say you're 13 and you have no relationship with your vulva, and you've only gotten the messages from the culture and from likely from your family that masturbation is wrong and don't go there, don't touch yourself. And then perhaps as early as that age, you start interacting with boys who are consuming porn, and they are asking you to start doing things. And it's a lot harder to be clear on whether you actually want to do these things or not if you have zero relationship with your own body. So, and especially if you're wanting attention and wanting closeness, or wanting popularity, which a lot of the social pecking order is based on which girls can get the attention of the boys, et cetera. And I know I'm making huge generalizations here, but, follow me down this train of thinking. Versus, a girl who's grown up just doesn't mean we have to be encouraging our girls to masturbate all the time, but it's more just what's natural and what's developmentally normal. It's actually very, very normal for kids of all genders to start exploring their bodies and to discover that, hey, it can feel good to touch your genitals. And rather than layering all this cultural shame on top of them and freaking out and saying that's not okay, to give them the tools and the education and the boundaries of how to explore their bodies in a way where it is safe and okay for them. So it could be like, I noticed you were on the couch, like rolling around on a pillow. Maybe you're discovering that it feels good to touch your private parts, and I want you to know your body belongs to you, and it's perfectly okay to touch your private parts, but you want to do that in the safety and privacy of your own room. Something like that. So where we're creating space and context for our kids to explore their bodies at their own developmental rate without shame, but also appropriately with boundaries so that they're safe. And what follows in line with that is no one gets to touch your body without your permission, and you don't get to touch anyone's body without permission. At that point, now it's about a person, girl or boy, learning to take ownership of their own body for themselves. And then you cut to, 5 to 10 to 15 years later, they already have that foundation, so that then when it does come to having experiences with others, it's going to be that much easier for them to A, know what does and does not feel good, and B, to only say yes to things that are appropriate for them, and vice versa, to respect other people when they have boundaries or are asking for things, if that makes sense. So, I mean, for me, it very much is about all genders, boys and girls. I want all kids growing up in a healthy, safe way where they can, feel good in their bodies and also respect and be respectful of boundaries, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think a little more emphasis on girls is important because there's that much more taboo surrounding the vulva, and also that much more history of girls' bodies being owned and dominated within the power structures we find ourselves in, and that much more history of girls being totally cut off from their own desires and their own sense of what feels good in their bodies, because it's all about getting the guy or pleasing the guy, and it doesn't really matter if it feels good to the girl. It's all about just, kind of power and control. So that's why I want it for everybody, but I do place a little bit more emphasis on girls.
It's so interesting. A little bit of my perspective has opened because oftentimes when I think about sex ed and advocate for my little Yoni and people like you to be in the forefront, it's usually about sex. I'm usually thinking about two people. Rarely have I thought about in the inclusion of masturbation and sex ed. It's just my brain had not gone there because it hasn't been necessarily a focus of mine. Masturbation for me as a child around that time, as I kind of my sexuality got woken up through a relationship and through sex, then I realized as a kid, I became, that's when I started masturbating. I didn't really masturbate before that at 15, maybe a little bit, but not as much. But once the container was opened, I found myself wanting more sex and more sex and more sex and connection, and also pleasuring myself too. And that's even still to this day when I have gone for periods of time, probably in my adulthood, like a year and a half without sex with another human being. And where am I going with this? But masturbation is just, that's where I was going. So when I do though, when I am open back up and I start having sex, then I crave it even more and it gets activated even more. And then I began more of a masturbation practice. So thank you for bringing that into consciousness of the inclusion of masturbation in sex ed programs too. There's two directions. I want to go into some of these books, as you say, from age 3. You also say, is My Little Yoni, just to clarify, is it for boys and girls, or is this first initiative for girls?
So My Little Yoni, she is a shame-busting superhero for all genders. And, sometimes people have a hard time with that because you'll see, I'm sure if you'll see this when we post the episode, or if you go to mylittleyoni.com, you'll see that there's a prominent vulva symbol on her face. And so people say, how could a vulva superhero? That's inappropriate for that to be for boys. And we completely disagree. And many of our customers would disagree. Because our perspective is, hey, the symbol of the vulva, we want to reclaim the symbol of the vulva as a symbol that is the source of life. All humans, regardless of sexual orientation or gender or anything else, the vulva is the source of life. And so, hey, let's respect and honor the vulva as the source of life. Additionally, there are phallic symbols everywhere. And one of the big issues we've identified is that the vulva has been so shrouded in secrecy and shame. So we're like, hey, let's bring it out. Let's celebrate the symbol. We're not going to be able to celebrate the symbol or really get to the root if we keep trying to, hide it in the process. So we want to get that symbol out there and celebrate. And then another component is, you'll see when you see the character, she's just adorable. And there's nothing sexual about My Little Yoni, the character. And that's also really important to us to say, hey, the vulva is not intrinsically sexual. Our culture has sexualized the vulva, but the vulva is not intrinsically sexual. And part of the problem and part of the reasons why people don't teach their kids until it's very late in the game, sometimes too late, is because we're trying to save the kids from things that are inappropriate or pornographic, and we're saying, hey, like that. The way of protecting our children is not to keep things secret and then not have these conversations, because guess what? By avoiding those conversations, guess what we are doing? We're just letting them fend for themselves and find whatever information they may find from older friends or siblings or the internet. So we're literally, and this is not, I'm not trying to bash porn, that's its own thing, but when we don't have these conversations with our kids, what winds up happening is porn does wind up becoming the primary source of quote unquote sex education. And that's an issue because it's not education. It's adult entertainment. But the reality is, I think it's something like, this is not the exact statistics, but it's close to it. Something like 80% of 11-year-olds have already stumbled upon porn. So, that's why My Little Yoni has a call to parents to, hey, let's work through our own discomfort as adults and then do the right thing by our kids and start initiating these conversations. And a cute character like Yoni is here to make things easier and be like, hey, you see my face? You see that there's a vulva where my nose should be? Not so scary. The vulva doesn't have to be scary. It can be a fun, friendly conversation for the whole family. So that's a little bit of why that symbol, and also why we think it's an appropriate symbol for all genders. And so something like we have 10 books, and the book that we have, What's the M Word, which is the title where we focus on masturbation, that is more geared towards people with vulvas and for girls. But for example, the All About Consent, that's for everybody. And we do have a book called The Spectacular Truth, which is specifically male-assigned anatomy, So we do have books specifically for boys as well. And we have boy moms and boy parents who even buy our vulva anatomy book, that's called The Amazing Truth. They buy that for their sons because they're like, hey, we want our boys to understand vulva anatomy too. Because in all likelihood, or not, I shouldn't say in all likelihood, there's a good chance that our boys will eventually grow up and interact with girls and women, or interact with women. And we don't want their first exposure to female anatomy to be porn. We would much rather their first exposure to female anatomy to be an educational, vetted character like My Little Yoni.
All of that. So, I love that first up, yeah, we all come from sex, and we all are birthed from the vagina, the vulva. I love that you're bringing young men, boys into the conversation now. It'll make them better lovers in the future. Also, I would love for both men, women, girls, and boys to understand the menstrual cycle. It took me until 35 to start to understand, like, oh, these, 28 days, and this is how it's affecting my hormone level. And so my energy level is affected and my emotional well-being is being affected. But nobody taught me that. It took until 35 years old. Also, at age 15, when I first started menstruating, well, I was probably 12. So from 12 to 15, 16, sometimes I got really bad cramps. And at times I would be on the floor crying because it was so painful. And, the OBGYN put me on birth control. And at that point, I felt as though I got a life sentence to birth control. It took 10 years for me to realize, like, why am I taking this every day? It was great that, yes, at 15, I had cramps and then I had a boyfriend and now I'm on birth control. So, yippee to all that. I wasn't going to get pregnant. But it also took away that decade for me to actually learn my own body and to be in my own body without a pill that is helping to regulate cramps. So if at the time I would have loved to be 13 and somebody taught me to breathe when you're in pain, or instead of trying to go about your normal everyday life this is a day of rest for you. That's what just telling you to go rest. But it took so long for me to unpack and unveil that information. And then I'd also realize, when you're in relationship with a significant other, and for me, I date men. So when I'm in a relationship with a man and I'm experiencing my cycle, I want him to I want to share that experience with him. And I found that in the dating process, usually I am now the person who is teaching them all about. They're like, wow, I've never met a woman who knows about her menstrual cycle like you do. But that information has given me the ability to deepen my relationship with a partner because I know more about myself, but so often we're not even privy to that information. So is that something that My Little Yoni is also taking on as well?
I love everything you just shared and can resonate and relate to a lot of what you just shared. And I agree, this information should be out there and starting much younger. And also I applaud you for finding it for yourself. And the fact that it took you, who you're such an explorer of different topics and self-growth and healing and just personal transformation. The fact that it took you till 35, really, I just wanted to reshare that because it's like, oh, wow. If someone like you who's so interested in self-development, it takes till 35, like, just where does that leave the rest of us, right? So I guess I'm just echoing and reaffirming everything you just shared there. And in terms of My Little Yoni, so we have, in our 10-book series, each book goes through a major topic that's part of comprehensive sex ed guidelines. So, we have our All About Consent book. Most people don't realize this. Only 7 states in the United States require consent to be part of sex ed curriculum. That's a little terrifying. Yeah. So 7 states require consent. But to your question around periods, one of our 10 books is called Power of Periods. So it's completely dedicated to the menstrual cycle and to teaching about periods. And we actually have a charity program where every 10 books we sell, we donate a book to disadvantaged youth and to at-risk families. And one of our very first partner charities is actually period.org. So all of our period titled books that we donate, we donate through period.org. And that's great because it's an organization entirely devoted to period equity and education. So I love that we do that. And on that note, I'll just mention, because I'm really excited, on December 1st, we're able to start receiving tax deductible donations. So our foundation will be fully live, because basically when we decided to focus on sex education, for us, we just want to get this education out there as broadly and freely as possible. And so now that we're getting our foundation formed, we'll be able to do that even more.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I see all the energy and the effort that goes into that. You know, you say that only 7 states are teaching consent. Why not the other states? Why is sex ed lacking?
Only 7 states are required to. So that means that more could, but they're not required to. Similarly, only 23 states are required to teach medically accurate sex ed. So, you know, and there's 50. So less than half of the states are required to teach medically accurate sex ed, which basically means it comes down to the discretion of the district or the school or the state to teach whatever they want. So it could be just totally scare tactic. It could be abstinence only education, which, you know, our government has spent billions of dollars funding abstinence only sex ed curriculum, which the data's in. We know it's ineffective because you look at the states that are most gung-ho on the abstinence-only education, and that's where, you know, teen pregnancy is definitely, there's higher instances of teen pregnancy in states that emphasize abstinence-only education versus we know from, I mean, the most progressive sex ed programs are generally in countries like the Netherlands, and they start receiving, they generally start receiving accurate anatomy, ages 4+, and they're basically comprehensive sex ed starts as early as kindergarten. And it doesn't mean you're learning everything all at once, but developmentally you're learning what's appropriate to learn at 4 and 5, which is accurate anatomy. And then like it keeps continuing from there. And you look in those cultures and, there's less sexual violence, less teen pregnancy. So correlation doesn't equal causation, but it's pretty clear to see that preparing our kids with more information leads to better later outcomes than keeping them in the dark. And in terms of why is that, most people don't know the history of sex ed in the United States. But it's a pretty sinister past. And so sex ed was first created kind of in the beginning part of the 20th century. And there was a doctor and very influential thought leader named Stanley Hall who basically created the definition of adolescence, because most people don't realize this. But prior to the Industrial Revolution and industrialization, adolescence wasn't a thing. Kids were out in the fields working alongside their parents. Kids actually worked. Kids had to help the family unit sustain itself. But then with industrialization and more factories and cities, for the first time ever, there was something called child labor laws, which means now rather than kids being with their parents working alongside of them, there were this whole bracket of kids going through adolescence, or what we then ultimately named adolescence, who weren't working, were starting to have, their bodies changing, their hormones changing, and they had a ton of time on their hands. So that's kind of, I can't get too much into it, but it's kind of interesting to think about it, because we just think this is a category of the development that's always been there. And actually, no, it really wasn't a category of development for most of human history.
Wow.
But in the beginning of the 20th century, adolescence became a thing. And so paired with that was, that's really when the school system started going. And that's also when Stanley Hall really recognized that the changing hormones and sexuality was a big part of the turning, because obviously it is. And also keep in mind, people got married and had kids way earlier, like historically before. But anyways, this guy, Stanley Hall, very influential doctor and writer, he actually said that masturbation would be the downfall of a productive industrialized society. And so in order to prevent masturbation later in life, he recommended circumcision for boys.
Is this the Kellogg's guy too?
I'm not sure if he was Kellogg's, but okay. I'm sure I wouldn't be surprised if Kellogg's funded his propaganda. I'm not sure. But he recommended circumcision for boys and putting acid on the clitorises of baby girls, which the latter was so barbaric they didn't keep doing that. But people don't realize that's why American men are circumcised. It's not about religion. It's not about cleanliness. You look in Europe, most men are not circumcised. It literally was an anti-masturbation agenda that started circa, I don't know, I think it's 1910-ish, in that range. So that is fascinating. And I only share that to highlight that this is the guy who originally created sex education in the USA.
Wow. I'm so glad you brought this up because there was a circumcision probably about 9 months ago. My intellectual side started researching everything. I needed to know everything about circumcision. My brain could not comprehend why we're still cutting off baby dicks. And so I'm glad you're including this. And what I'm hearing from you is that your stance on this or your opinion on it would be to stop it.
Well, what I would say is I find it very interesting in the U.S. how I feel like the U.S. can be morality police very easily. And like, how dare they do female genital mutilation over there in the Middle East? They're so barbaric over there. And then meanwhile, it's perfectly okay to take our infant boys and, cut off their foreskins when they have no ability to consent as infants. I just find that a really disturbing double standard. And, it is up to the choice of parents, but I feel like most parents don't actually have all the information. And they're just doing it because it's what we do in our culture. And I personally, I can't tell anyone what to do with their own kids, but what I can do is try and educate people around the history and say, hey, did you know that this has nothing to do with cleanliness, nothing to do with hygiene? And this is actually the legacy of a really messed up individual named Stanley Hall, who was totally anti-sex. And I mean, it's just crazy to think that, the fact that he thought that masturbation would harm the productivity and GDP and the economy, and that was his reasoning for circumcision. It's just utter insanity. And I just find it interesting. One other thing about this guy, he was an offshoot of Victorianism. And he was very proud about the fact that he never had sex with his wife. He was like, see, I am restraining my urges, and I am like the quintessential productive guy. That's how he put himself out there. And meanwhile, every morning, he received an enema from a handsome male orderly.
An enema? Every morning?
Every morning. Okay. So... anyways, I just like another example of why the more as adults we can get to the heart of our own sexuality. And I think it's too easy to judge others and point the finger. And it's like, what about learning about our own sexuality? What about getting a bit more right and a bit more comfortable within ourselves? I think it's a lot harder to condemn others at that point. And so we see this time and time again, politicians who are like, anti-gay rights or whatever, and then they're caught with a gay prostitute the next week. Yeah. It's just like that whole, it's insane.
Do you know anything about how circumcision affects a boy man psychologically later on in life? Or does it?
I don't know that I'm qualified to get too into this subject specifically. I think there are some really amazing anti-circumcision activists. That might be a whole episode in and of itself. But I think the main thing as it comes to sex education is just knowing that, back to your question of why do only 7 states require consent education, and why do only 23 states require medically accurate sex ed? And I would say the reason is because we've never had an overhaul, and we're still kind of operating under the same structure that this guy in 1910 created for all of us. And I would say my belief is that one of the reasons why there's been such little progress in the field of sex education is because it's taboo. It's easy to ignore. And, so it's like it just hasn't gotten a lot of attention. And then also, unfortunately, it's been used to divide things. It's been politicized when it shouldn't be. And that's why with My Little Yoni, we're not so much focused on policy change in schools. We're really focused on talking to parents directly. Because we're like, hey, we have Christian moms in the Midwest who buy our books. And we have, urban moms in New York. And we have Chinese moms from Singapore. And we literally have moms from all these different brackets. And so we're saying, hey, kids having good information that prepares them to be healthier and to have healthier relationships, that's bipartisan. And so that's how we approach it. We don't want to participate in the political warfare. And so far, we've been pretty effective because we have moms who come from both sides, all sides of the political spectrum, who see Yoni and they're like, hey, this isn't so scary. And hey, you're actually talking sense. And yes, we want our kids to have a better time of it. So I try to give parents the benefit of the doubt, and also to believe that if parents actually get the statistics of what's going on out there, they'll want to make better choices.
The holidays are coming up, and I was one of the backers of your Kickstarter campaign. And in doing it, yes, I was like, yes, I want to support it. And second, I'm going to get some books. And I have these books at my house now that I haven't given away. I am not a mother yet at this moment in time, but have tons of friends with kids. And I talk to them about, how they are speaking to their children about sex and sex ed, because I'm curious. And so I believe with the holiday season coming up, it's such a good gift. And where do you suggest that, do they start with a particular book? You have 10 books. Should they buy all the books? Is there, someone goes to the site, where should they begin?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think that the whole series does go together. So of course the whole series is great. But the first 2 books in the series is The Amazing Truth, which is really getting into assigned female anatomy, and then The Spectacular Truth, which is getting into assigned male anatomy. And those are good for 3+. Now, it's also good for a 35-year-old who's never learned anatomy. That's the thing. Even though the books are geared towards kids, just the process of creating the series, I learned so much and continue to learn so much. And so that's kind of the feedback we get. And then, so I would say it's important for adults to look at them. And while we do have recommended ages on each of the titles, it's also good as the parent or as the aunt or the uncle or just the caring adult in a kid's life to check it out, and then also tailor it to any given kid and their developmental journey. For example, some kids are already masturbating at 3. So you might want to give them what's the M word, or versus some really are not even exploring that at 7, in which case you still might want to introduce that topic. But a good rule of thumb is, definitely start with accurate anatomy. So that's why the first 2 titles for everybody. But then kind of you want to be initiating these conversations and also letting the kids steer. So some kids are naturally very curious and precocious and are going to ask lots of questions. So having the tools and the books to help answer those questions is very helpful. And then some kids don't start asking questions. For example, my son, we've had to introduce different subjects over the years because he's not that naturally curious, so we kind of have to introduce it to him, but also be careful not to overwhelm them with too much information. I also think that's where books can be very helpful, because it's like, hey, check this book out, and then if you have questions, we can discuss it together. And one other thing I would share is that for us, it's about framing all this subject matter as a part of life, a natural, normal part of life that we want to have ongoing discussions about as it comes up. Versus, I think a lot of parents have this notion of there's the talk, and you sit down and have this one big serious talk, and that puts so much pressure on it. When the reality is we're saturated in a very sexual, there's sexual images flying at us all the time. And beyond that, it's just a natural part of life. So to take the pressure off of it being one conversation and seeing it as an ongoing series of conversations that happen over a course of years, I find that that's a lot more helpful. And that you don't have one shot to get it right.
Yeah, I think that's a really good piece of advice. I know that your work also spans beyond My Little Yoni and includes couples as well. And I want to make sure to speak to that too, because it seems as though, is there some knocking happening? No. It seems as though that, it must be challenging for parents to provide sex ed to their children if they're not feeling alive in their sexual experiences as well, or connected to a partner or connected to themselves in any sexual way. So I do know your artistic project is also working with couples, correct? Can you speak a little to that?
Yeah, so there's a couple things in what you just shared. Number one, yes, I would say a lot of what makes this subject matter tough is that we're walking around with our own experiences and our own baggage when it comes to sexuality and even just our bodies and how we feel in our bodies. And all that being said, I would say, what's a better motivation for changing that story or working through some of that stuff than our youth? It's like sometimes, and I think that's true in a lot of different areas in parenting, or just being an aunt or uncle or, mentor, is, sometimes we don't change things for ourselves, but we can be really motivated to make different choices. For our youth, at least I would hope for that. And we see that in even making healthier food choices and wanting to eat healthier. For example, that's a very common thing, or a common moment when adults shift. It's when they become parents. And also the other thing is, you don't have to have things totally figured out for yourself to provide a better chance for the kids in your life. It's not about you getting it perfect, and then and only then can you have these conversations. You can figure stuff out alongside. It's wow, as the kids in your life are receiving hopefully a better education from the ground up, you can have a re-education alongside of them, and that can be inspiration for you to go find your own support groups or teachers or coaches or whatever. And then the other thing that I think makes it easier is just knowing that for kids, they're learning, especially the younger kids, they're learning about everything for the first time. And so it's really not a big deal. So all that discomfort and all that stuff, that's really something adults are walking around with. Versus kids, it's okay, you're learning that that's the sun and those are trees, and you're learning that that's your elbow and that's your knee and that's your nose and that's your penis and that's your vulva. It's like, it's all in the same category of this is the earth and this is your body and this is you learning how to navigate earth in your body. And it really, if we start young enough, it's pretty matter of fact. And I think people generally find it's not that big of a deal to have these conversations, honestly. And rather than having to figure it all out, that's why we created the books, to make it easier. And yeah, so that's where that is. And in terms of my other work, it's a collaboration I do with my husband. We actually work with couples and make visual art out of couples' love stories. So it's a really immersive, amazing experience. And the experience itself is very connecting and healing for them. But then the result of that experience is we produce amazing visual art that not only represents their love, but can also help remind them to connect to the essence of why they're together every time they look at it.
I love this. So essentially a couple would come to you and your husband, and I know your husband, from what I see from afar too, is that he is a successful, well-known photographer. So the two of you come together and you'll sit with a couple and you'll listen to and hear their love story, and then what happens? Like tell me more. I'm so intrigued and I want to come do this.
Yes. So what happens is, yes, you got it. We really, we interview them, we sit with them, we learn about their love story, and then kind of the two pathways. One is very focused on an original work of art, a painting that gets created, which usually photography is the base of that. So we photograph them in a style that lends itself to an incredible mixed media painting. Or we focus on the photographic arts, and we do just an incredible museum quality, like basically museum quality photographic art gets created out of it. And so those are generally the two pathways, and sometimes they come together, but yeah, we love it so much, just being able to be in that space with couples and to also bring them past any shyness where they're feeling celebrated and expressed, and then the art that gets created out of it's very exciting.
You're a former Tantra teacher. I imagine that's even still inside of you. You can't really be a former Tantra teacher. I think you always are a Tantra teacher. So I imagine that experience for the couple is very healing, and you're enlivening their love and their connection with one another. And I can see it as in, oftentimes with We Deepen, and when We Deepen first began with a dating experience, I'd work with singles, and couples had started coming and said, can you do stuff for us? Because we feel the only thing that's being marketed to us is therapy or sex parties. And you're bringing in a whole other category of intimacy, of things that you can do with your partner or your significant other. And I love that it's the additional aspect to this is art, is that not only do you receive a memorable experience, or you get a memorable experience, but you also get an item. Like it's like interactive experiential art is what you're giving this. So and definitely with the holiday season coming up too, I mean, this is like you have the perfect package offering for families. They can take care of their kids, or even prepare to have their children. Maybe they don't have children yet, prepare to have their children at the same time that they can deepen their intimacy with each other. It's like Wow. So perfect. I love it. Thank you. Thank you, Ariel, for coming and having this discussion with me. We could do, I imagine, a part 2, a part 3, a part 4 of our dialogue, because we didn't even get into your work as an angel investor, advisor, a fundraiser. You're a real life superhero. You know, feminine weapon to me is what I have taken on, and I married myself with being a feminine weapon and my own version of my own superhero. And to see you in your shine and in your work, it's magical to witness.
Thank you so much, Christina. And I was about to echo that back to you, that you're a superhero. So I like that we're in this moment of uniting as at least boss witches.
Yes. So many terms we could give it. Thank you for having this conversation. Thank you all for listening to another episode of Deep In with Christina. To discover Ariel's work, first you can go to mylittleYoni.com. Instagram, definitely go to the Instagram at mylittleYoni. And if they're also interested in booking a private session as a couple with you, where do they go for that?
Yeah, you could join our list. We work invitation only, and you can join and apply for that at lovesaints.com. Or you can reach out to me on Instagram. I have a private account. It's Ariel Saint White.
Thank you. Is there anything else that you'd like to share?
Oh, just thank you so much for having me on. The time always flies when we're together, and just thank you for your commitment to your community and continuing to show up. And I always love everything we get to do together. And thank you all for tuning in and listening today.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Again, if you, like I say always, that's what I mean when I say again, if you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with a friend, especially around this topic of sex education. If you have friends who have children, give this to them now so they can listen. If you want to have children, take this information in. It's really important. And I think it's part of how we transform and heal is through sex. I mean, we all come from sex. Erotic wellness, super important. So share this podcast, check out WeDeepen.com, see the schedule, come visit, join us, look at the Instagram, send me a message. I'm always open for any feedback or any thoughts that you have to share. And until next time, take care. Love you. Bye.